Welcome back, everyone. We are moving to the third panel and last panel of the day. This panel is about the role of leadership in driving behavior change. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Amit Narayan. Amit has been leading control risk engagements with clients, partners, and associates in India and across South Asia since January 2018. He's a member of the Asia Pacific Regional Executive Committee. Based in Mumbai, Amit brings over 25 years of experience in managing operational risks for multinational firms across India and the Asia Pacific region. His expertise includes advising on political and regulatory risk, pre-investment risk, public policy, labor disputes, and stakeholder mapping. Before joining Control Risk, Amit worked with multinational firms such as Edelman, Vodafone, the Walt Disney Company, and the Cable and Wireless. He has conducted over 100 days of crisis management and risk mitigation strategy workshops, as well as scenario planning exercises. Amit holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Sriram College of Commerce, Delhi University, and a master's degree in business economics from Delhi University. He is also a CQI and IRCA certified business continuity management systems lead auditor. Second, please welcome Ramesh Ramaswamy, Vice President and Business Head for APAC at Bosch SDS. Ramesh has a 25-year career marked by successful results in challenging business situations, complex organizational structures, and diverse cultural landscapes across various domains such as automotive, industrial manufacturing, and aerospace. He has successfully crafted new portfolios in digital industry 4.0 solutions and data analytics, established successful enterprise system services, and led automotive product engineering businesses across India, Germany, Mexico, and China. Next, we have Manish Dubey, Chief of Practice at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Manish is a governance and institutional development expert with over 25 years of consulting experience with national and state governments, multilateral and bilateral development partners, INGOs, and philanthropies. His extensive experience spans sectors such as rural and urban water supply and sanitation, urban development, natural resource management, and rural livelihoods across 20 Indian states. His clients include the World Bank, UNICEF, Asian Development Bank, Australian Agency for International Development, DFID, Global Sanitation Fund, and the Swedish International Development Agency. Manish's key areas of work include institutional design and strengthening program design and strategy, reform management support, strategic stakeholder communication, and sector portfolio and program level results. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Amit Narayan, Ramesh Ramaswamy, and Manish Dubey. Let's give them a warm round of applause. And I would like to invite Dr. Geeta Krishnan, Head of the Digital Blended Learning of IIHS, to moderate the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhinav. Good afternoon, everyone. It's been an interesting morning. We've been discussing policy level work around behavior. We've talked about training and brought in international experiences. One of the things we thought we'll bring in is to kind of look at behavior change and look at how it's affected in a domain that's completely divorced from what we were discussing in the morning, which is moving away from the development sector, from the government sector, from the social sector, and learn from another area where behavior change seems to be an ongoing requirement, an ongoing challenge. And a whole army of us kind of exist in that space primarily to drive behavior change. And that's what the larger world calls leadership. So if you look at leadership, a large part of leadership is basically broken down into just two things. One is managing people, the other is managing change. And change, to a large extent, is behavior change. There's also a market level change, but managing change both within your organizations, within your ecosystems, and in some cases even with government and larger entities. So that's the kind of conversation we thought we will have today, and try to see what we can learn from the private sector, from the corporate sector, and how we can bring that back in. And I'm really fortunate to have three very diverse individuals sitting on the table with me, because one of them, Manish, my colleague, is not quite from the corporate sector, but has been working extensively on projects in the development sector, which kind of lean on the corporate sector very significantly. So we thought we'll kind of get Manish to synthesize some of what we hear from Amit and Ramesh. Amit and Ramesh, thanks for joining us today. Both of you flew in. Amit had to fly in because he's based out of Bombay, and Ramesh was traveling and just got into Bangalore today and came straight here. So really appreciate your time and interest in being part of this conversation. So Abhinav gave a high-level introduction, a resume, if you will, of the three of you. But we'd like to kind of start off with you talking about a little bit about your organization, but in a certain context. So I'll kind of word a specific question for each of you, if that kind of helps us drive in the right direction. I'll start with you, Amit, right next to me. But you come from the world of risk, right? So control risk as the organization, but your work's also largely driven by risk, and you've done a fair bit of work in crisis management as well. So when we look at these scenarios, you largely have to drive change from the perspective of avoiding punitive challenges, from the perspective of avoiding the law, avoiding the law clamping down on you, as it were. And therefore, I would imagine your perspective on change management, and when I say change in your context, it's not just your organization and your colleagues, but the clients that you advise and the ecosystem that you're part of. So I'm assuming that that is a significant part of change management that you do. So in that context, if you can quickly talk us through what you do, what control risk does, and how you look at change management and behavior change. So over to you, Amit.
Thank you. And thank you for both the opportunity to be here as well as for the introduction. And I'll try and keep my initial comments brief and make about 2 points, which I then will hand off to my fellow panelists to comment on. There are kind of two aspects to government engagement. Engaging with stakeholders that risk professionals get most involved with most times. One is, sorry, I was just too far away. One is about reputation management. Reputation management is actually number one as a deemed risk or a residual risk that most organizations live and die by. Whether it's your share price, whether it's your partners, whether it's your consumers, you need to keep up your reputation, and therefore you have the inherent risk of losing that. And the unfortunate part, and this is what we realize, is that talking about reputation doesn't get you very far. But when you talk about the risk, which is the risk of losing that reputation, you suddenly have the interest of not just the CEOs, but also the others. So the first thing to kind of evaluate or think about when it comes to thinking about how organizations like in the nonprofit sector can both approach corporations, but also learn from the private sector, if that is a phrase or if that is a possibility, it is to understand how companies evaluate risk and reputation, the balance of risk and reputation. And I think the most kind of finely nuanced point of view on that is that reputation is what you build in the dark when no one's watching, so that when the spotlight of risk comes, you have the credibility or the opportunity to kind of navigate that. Okay, so that's the kind of functional aspect. The second is around identifying who your stakeholders are from a risk point of view. And the government is, for better or for worse, and this is not just true of India, but globally, government is rated as the highest in the form of risk stakeholder for any corporation. Simply because, like you said, I mean, the impact of getting it wrong with the government, either from a emotive, subjective point of view, where the government sees you as not being working in national interest, if that's a phrase that's allowed in this discussion, or if you are seen as not paying your taxes or not doing your bit for the citizenry, etc., that then becomes a problem in the corporation itself. And you will see the amazing resonance that has to the world that you folks primarily come from as well. It's absolutely the same. And so there is a very finely established risk matrix process, which I think Apurva alluded to, which I'd like to kind of, I don't know if he's here today, but I don't know if he's here now, but he spoke about the importance of mapping risks from a stakeholder point of view, which I think is quite important. And I think those are the 2 points I'd kind of make right at the outset, just from a private sector corporation point of view, and where that could come in handy as a rule of thumb for the non-profit sector.
Yeah. So when you look at, I mean, we talked about risk and risk management from a private sector perspective. Uh, how does that kind of pan out in the government space, in the kind of projects that you've done, we've do in the development space? Because I'm wondering if there is the play of it which works against behavior change, which is that if by driving behavior change, if I'm going to embark on something risky, is that inimical to my interests, and therefore do I kind of try and stay in the same puddle, or is there an incentive for government for projects like that to push for change, push for behavior change in the face of risk?
You're talking about in the context of IHS or a more
In the
sort of-
larger context, I mean.
in a larger context. Okay, I'm just taking a step back on this whole government question. Like Amit said, governments are particularly sort of invested in the optics of things. Fine. They want to be seen to be doing the right things with the right people and so on, and that the public money is getting used in the most appropriate manner. At least the projection needs to be there. When it comes, the behavior change aspect of it, I mean, you just take a step back and look at the entire history of government programs in the country. Post-independence. What have government programs found? What are the kind of behavior changes that they have sought to promote? Make less children, plant more trees, get vaccinated, use more fertilizer at one point of time, don't litter,
Segregate
adopt
waste.
toilets, segregate waste, plant trees, etc. By design, government programs will touch on things what we used to call in college days motherhood statements kind of things, which are largely things that are unexceptionable. Fine? Largely. I mean, there are times when they touch on contentious territory, but largely the broad drift is the government will not touch something that radically tries to alter social relations. It will not touch something that tries to radically alter power relations, though there have been honorable exceptions on this as far as the government is concerned.
Yeah.
Several of them. So, now in such circumstances, and each program, each generation of each program, every new program that gets launched is an expectation that people will conduct themselves differently. Both the so quote unquote beneficiaries of the program, as well as the people within the government system are going to implement the program. Because, and that's precisely the rationale for any government program. Because if you're going to do the same things, same old things with the same old methods, you're not going to launch a new program. Right? So the issue is the government is invested in behavior change as long as it largely does not disturb status quo. Okay? I mean, I'll stop here. I mean, the other dimensions to this whole thing. I just wanted to sort of...
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was just coming to Ramesh on this. One of the things you said is, they don't want to rock the status quo. I mean, they want to do behavior change in the context of what's there. So, boxing within your same ring, as it were, which means that what continues, continues. And as much as possible, let's not rock the boat, etc., etc. And that's something that one sees a lot in organizational behavior as well. When you have a stable workforce, when you have a stable business model, etc. So you don't change as rapidly. And we've had instances in the corporate sector which are quite diverse. And you look at Nokia, you look at BlackBerry, you look at even GE to some extent. They've all had their challenges because they believe that the past is an indicator of the future and nobody is going to come and challenge it. And I'm just going to ask that question directly to you, Ramesh. You've spent a very, very long time in Bosch. Bosch itself is a very stable organization, very well-known organization, very respected organization. And you have spent like 15, 16 years in Bosch. So when you look at organizations like that, how have you looked at behavior change? How have you looked at change itself in the larger context and responded to that?
Thanks, Krishnan. So good you kind of diverted the question to the organizations. I was wondering, when I walked into this place, what am I doing here? But now I understand the context better. Okay, jokes apart, I think it's a very valid question from an organization point of view. and my background is 16 years in Bosch, and prior to that, about 10 odd years experience with about major time in GE, which is known for organizational change and pivots. And this was a time when Jack Welch was still there, and later Jeff Immelt came in. I'll put a more general answer first and then go down to the specifics. I think a general answer is an organizations find equally difficult to make changes, simply because there are entrenched interests, positions, roles that are created. And largely the organizations try to hold them. Now, this is a spectrum. There are organizations that are very fast in changing it, but that very fast is like at least a year. So when you have made a broad level change at a board level, it will continue for 2 years. Business unit changes happen, minimum is 1 year. That is a faster organization. The slower organization, that takes easily 3 to 4 years. Organizations don't change because they want to change. They change because the market forces them to change. So the question is how fast they see the reality of the market. Okay, now if you take the mega trends, for example, 10 years back, cloud was a trend. There were people who adopted it. There were people who said, this is just another big server, right? And then they said, we don't need to do that. Then they moved around to say, we can have a private cloud. And then they said, okay, now cloud is in. Similarly, EVs in the automotive sector, there were organizations, including Bosch, that said that, EV is more polluting because the entire ecosystem of an electric vehicle is not just the battery, but where the battery comes from to where the charging points are and how polluting they are, etc. But then the winds of change are such that they ended up accepting that they have to do something in EV. Now the difference is, do you want to do a lithium-ion EV or do you want to do a hydrogen EV? There can be a difference, but you can't stop the change. So, as Joseph Schumpeter said, it's a perennial gale of creative destruction. It's very true there that the market forces you to change, and the market doesn't change because everybody in the market is suddenly adopted. It's those disruptive companies that make you adopt. It's a Tesla that makes you adopt. It's a Chinese government and the entire Chinese manufacturers adopting EV that have made the IC irrelevant or would be irrelevant in the next 7 to 10 years. It is these kind of changes that really matter. And then, including Bosch, including other companies, realize that the change has already happened, now we better adapt. And then they change the complete board, the business units, they amalgamate them, they reduce the size. They themselves wouldn't probably want to go for it unless you have a disruptor that does it. So you have the disruptor companies on one end and the stable status quoist companies on the other. And then you have everybody in between. So market really changes because of those trends. And when market changes, companies change. And those who don't see the writing on the wall early, they go on a gradual decline. And we have seen it in many examples from Kodak to others, and we have Xerox, etc. So the point is, now coming within the organizations, now these are mega trends. To make the question a little more simpler to everyday life, right? I have seen GE, for example, change much faster internally because they have a culture of super achievement. The culture there was that, for example, I have 20 people in my team, I would give targets to all the 20, and I will only give them targets of what it is to meet the targets. I will not tell you what it is to exceed. And I leave it to you because I feel you can exceed as much as possible. So everybody anyway meets, but now I evaluate at the end of the year who's exceeded the maximum, who's exceeded the least, unless you have not even met. So the ones who have least exceeded are removed. So they have exceeded, but they have not exceeded as much as others. And this applies right from when I was a team lead in those days, and I was in a junior position, right up to CEO, where the CEO has told all your peer CEOs achieved, but you achieved the least. Your share price is better, your profits are good, but others achieved more profits, relatively speaking, and so you need to go. So that is one kind of a culture, and then there is other kind of culture which also protects the people, competency, which gives importance to technology and gives importance to technical expertise for a long time. So Bosch is probably more on this side, if not on the extreme. GE was on the left extreme. GE wanted to change internally, and so are companies like 3M, so are companies like Coke, so are companies like IMG, so are many other companies. They want to internally change because they feel if I don't change, somebody else will. They're always in a perennial urgency and fear. Okay, and here are others who are probably a little lackadaisical. So you have this spectrum. So the question is, this kind of a company, it's very easy to make an org change because you keep saying how the customers are changing, what products I need to make changes, etc. So GE themselves came up with bring GE Digital as an example, and they made predicts and so on. They failed. They made acquisitions of oil and gas, they failed, and then the entire company busted. So the flip side of that kind of a change is you always, in terms of urgency, always want to make pivots. You don't want to settle down. And in the process, some of the pivots don't work, then you go bust. Whereas the other companies who are not trying to make that change internally wait for the market to do because they don't want to be the early adopters. They would rather be a late adopter, if not a laggard, in the bell curve. So for companies of the latter kinds, the organization change is always externally driven. For the organizations of the former kind, I think the change is far easier. So they adopt new technology, new philosophies, new ways of working, adopt the latest trends. So the leadership that is taken is always taken what kind of capability they bring in this aspect. It's not leadership of an operational kind, leadership of a strategic kind. Do you always see a strategy to shift? Do you always see a strategy to make the change yourself? And those are the leaders who are always promoted internally as well as taken from outside. They're not given a long lease of time. They're given 1.5 years. Either they're out or they are making a change. And there the changes are very fast. Changes are top down. Here the changes take time because they have to come up through the ranks. And then the top guys sometimes will resist, but the middle management is the one that brings it. So here the middle management is the key because they are younger, they see the market more, they try to bring the change. Here the top guys are much younger, they are always driven to do something different, something higher, something faster, and think differently. And so it's organization spectrum that matters. And so the ones on the left-hand side or the former ones are the ones, if you are very dynamic or if you want to make the change happen, you should be. In the other ones, you will gravitate towards those business units that are probably more startup kinds. That's why people like me can't be in a typical Bosch. We are into a digital unit, which is more like a startup in the sense of the culture, in sense of the working. And then these organizations also get CEOs who now realize, for example, our current equivalent of a CEO is an ex-McKinsey guy. So he obviously been in Bosch for 10, 15 years, but prior to that was completely grounded in McKinsey. So if the business results are not there, he's making the change faster in about 2 years to see the writing on the wall, which earlier would have taken 5 years. So the leadership change at the top is very different now. We have board members who are from outside. And so the organization culture is quite different, since you asked about Bosch. And I've seen this change also happen in other organizations. You take CEOs or board members from parallel and adjacent organizations, you go beyond your industry boundary to say that what kind of leadership I need to bring. So an FMCG will not always have an FMCG board member. They'll probably from retail or pharma, right? And sometimes even hardcore secondary industries like steel will probably have leadership from FMCG because they want to imbibe that culture. So they say industry domain, I have enough people, but I want outside industry practices. When your mindset changes to that, the change is much faster, as long as the initial successes are good.
Thanks. Yeah. So I think it's interesting you talked about Bosch and GE, it's two ends of the spectrum, so across sectors in a sense. Coming back to you, Amit, you worked across different sectors, right? So you worked in telcos, you worked with the BFSI sector, with IT, etc. Are there some industry effects? I mean, there is a the competition as a pivot to change is something that we see in the private sector. But do you see industry effects? Because each of the industries that you work in are terribly competitive, to put it mildly, and face disruptions of unspeakable levels. Do you see kind of differences between the industries that you work with, be it in risk appetite, be it in absorbing change, etc.?
Yes, I do. And I'm trying to see how I can answer that question in order to kind of make it relevant to the nonprofit sector. So I'll try and do that. Effectively, to borrow from what Ramesh just said, it's when the market changes that the company changes. And the fact that telecom is as competitive as it is, or the entertainment industry, which also I've been a part of with the Walt Disney Company, is as competitive as it is, fundamentally is driven by the fact that the basics of the industry have changed in the last generation, if you will. When some of us started working, the tele density of India was 3%, and we never thought it would ever cross more than 10%. And look at us now, right? I mean, and it didn't change by all of us moving to landlines. The technology that drove communications changed. Same is true of media as well. We didn't move from a two-channel market to now, not just a multi-channel, but a multimodal form of entertainment consumption. On what that means for the nonprofit sector, there are two things. One, understanding how the market is changing and who's driving that change. So if you kind of think about the government and the government stakeholder, to borrow from Manish, government's biggest stakeholder is other people, the people who vote, citizens, etc. And gratifying, despite all of the red mist and the clouds that gather around how change is getting impacted in this country through non-governmental means, the fact remains that the success of SBM is driven by the fact that people have adopted at some level that change. And they want that, if not for themselves, then for their children, if not for their own household, but for the larger community, and if not for their own state, maybe down to their village and whatever else. So the leveraging the kind of power of the voter or the consumer or the market, if you kind of use a purely corporate point of view to governance, is important, and being and using them as advocates to kind of push for that would be a critical thing. Going back to your specific question on how sectors are different, it's equally true. I mean, for a sanitation program to work, you have a different set of influencers. It could have been mothers in the past, it is now daughters, or it could be grandmothers now. Whoever reaches that understanding first is influencing that change. That's not the case often with say another sector. If you kind of look at example of another energy is a good idea. Thank you very much. What is driving change in the renewable space at the moment is not so much end consumers, although they are as well, but just the fact that the government understands that India's road to development or becoming a developed country cannot be the road that China took, cannot be the road that Western economies took. We simply don't have the space in the world to look at and we have to have an inclusive, carbon neutral road to development, and therefore renewable energy is getting the kind of push that it is. So different motivations exist in different sectors, but I think in each case, going back to fundamentals and understanding who the consumer is, and I think a lot of comment has been made about, I think it was you who said, best policy is affected when you listen to the people who are impacted by it. And I think that's very true, because from a corporate point of view, it's the quintessential market survey. What is the need? How do you behavior science in that sense is very much driven by the same logic that a consumer survey or a consumer brand promise is driven by. And being able to leverage and identify the synergies between those two is actually a very compelling force.
So Manish, yeah.
Yeah, good.
No, I was just picking on this word competition, my pet word, as you can see. But so, I mean, there's a kind of synergy between what Ramesh and Amit said, in terms of, there being an external force that kind of drives change, that drives industry. So Newton's third law in some sense. But what's the equivalent of that in the government space?
So I just want to take a step back and talk about 2-3 things. When I said that the government and in terms of behavior change does not push for a contentious agenda, it does not necessarily mean that the change agenda that it is advocating is simple. Right? It's just that it is not disruptive of social or power relations. But each of those things that I was talking about is a difficult thing to achieve. Number one. Number two, both Ramesh in particular spoke about this whole question of the market signal that you're putting. Now, it works it works very differently in the development sector. Yes, the government is trying to respond to the people. But what do people fundamentally look for? They look for decent livelihoods.
Yeah.
They look to be safe. They want decent healthcare. They want decent education, water in their homes, clean surroundings, and so on. Everybody aspires to that, right? Now, and the government's job is to deliver. Fine. Now, as some of the behavior change agenda that the government focuses on is in terms of saying, okay, I am making my bid to sort of do all these things for you, say water supply and sanitation and so on. In return, I expect a certain cooperative behavior from you. Don't litter, don't waste water, etc., and so on and so forth. That's a clear message. There are certain things that you don't get clear market signals from. Right? I have never heard of anybody say, raise my electricity bill because the subsidy burden on the government is too high. Nobody says that, right?
Or vote against air quality.
Or vote against air.
Vote for air quality.
So, while people want it. But, so there are certain things that are not explicit. So, as far as the government is concerned and the larger development sector is concerned, it's important to listen to the market sort of, they respond to the sort of basic things that they are looking for, right? And creating the right conditions for growth, empowerment, enabling things, and so on and so forth. But also be conscious that not all of those things will be explicitly asked for. And that certain things and certain agendas will have to be teased out from that and brought into play. And those might confound, because often these agendas are teased out in bureaucratic sort of offices and so on, rather than an actual engagement with the community to figure out how best do I pitch this idea to you. It's not done that way, so it makes it all the more tougher. But I just wanted to make the larger point that this whole question of market, the signal is not always explicit. The end result that people are seeking for, yes. The intermediate behavior change is required, possibly. But the signals, not always explicit.
Okay, so how do we work around that usually?
How do we work around that? Good question. Okay. I think the basic recognition, and I think it's there in many of these frameworks like SDGs and so on and so forth, is understanding that there is a life of dignity, safety, and a certain basic standard of living that everybody aspires for, is entitled to. There are pathways to achieving that. Now, there are certain actions and behaviors that from the sort of community and the larger public side that would encourage those things to happen, and those nudges need to come. Right? But there are certain things that are not explicit, but they nevertheless needs to be promoted. So that's another parallel set of things that must unfold. The key, I think, here is to understand. I mean, I go back to this. I don't know how many of you have read Rag Darbari, the novel by Sri Lal, and this is said way back in the 50s and 60s, where he talks about this whole thing. And it's a satire, of course, where he says that, The people in rural areas were so dumb that they did not realize that producing more children was a bad thing and planting trees was a good thing and so on and so forth. The thing is, the good in many cases, so the good in many cases is obvious, including to communities. The question is, are you appealing to the right, are you making it easier for them to make it happen? Right? For example, there's this whole subsidy thing about giving up gas subsidies, etc. that happened. There was a certain ease with which you could do this, and therefore it happened. If you made it really cumbersome, like 10 forms and go to 10 offices, even people who actually surrendered would not have done that. Okay? So you have to make that thing easy. The second package that I'm talking about, where the need is not explicit, the behavior change expectations are a bit more muddy. That's something, and those are invariably the sort of top-driven agendas where people, and I've been party to several of these discussions in Delhi and various state capitals and so on and so forth. There's a new scheme to be launched. Okay, X amount of money for this, for infrastructure, X, Y, Z, and so on and so forth. Suppose it's a metro scheme, this line, that line, all that sort of thing, big priorities, etc. Ridership, it will happen. The sort of belief that if I provide a metro, how can people not ride it? But the fact is that metros have a ridership issue.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm saying that, we need to understand why people don't do things that seem blindingly obvious to people like us or people sitting in government. There are good reasons why they don't happen. Yeah,
they're quite complex problems, and I'm just also reflecting on competition. One of the things you spoke about is that when the ruling dispensation changes and someone new comes in, there is an imperative or at least some kind of motivation to do something new, something different, in the common good, of course. So that, to my mind, seems to be one strand of competition, right? I've just come to power, I need to show that I can do something good and something different from what the previous dispensation has done. But to me, that seemed like one strand of power, one strand of competition, which means you can expect some change every 5 years, even if there is no change in dispensation. Second thing I'm wondering, in a country like India, we've seen kind of mixed response on this front. For instance, a lot of work that we do in Tamil Nadu, they've come back and said, can you show us what's happening in other states? Can we learn from there and implement here? On the other hand, we went to a different state, and since this is being recorded, I will not mention the state. We went to a different state, Ananthamanai, and there was a resistance to saying, why should we learn from a different state? We know what we want and we are very unique, etc. So how do these dynamics play out when it comes to competition in the very quoted sense?
Okay. So some of it is genuine. Fine. Some of our colleagues, I'll give you a very concrete example and a very recent example. Some of our colleagues were visiting a series of metro agencies in various parts of the country, trying to figure out, what are the common challenges, etc., and so on, and what are the opportunities, where people like us could intervene and support and things like that. One city we went to, they heard us out and they said, we know all this, we've done all this, we're not interested. Fine. They actually have done it. So we are probably wrong in going and pitching our tent there, but having said that, we did it. So they probably have done it. They're quite open to sharing their experience. Now, there will be, depending on, this is actually a very complex thing. It's a very individual dependent thing. It's a very departmental, secretary dependent, in government sort of dependent thing. In some cases, they'll be very open to the idea of saying, okay, we are happy to learn from these. But they would want that learning to happen in a neutral space. Right? Or be facilitated by a neutral party, much like you and your team do.
Yeah.
They don't want somebody else, a rival, a similar agency,
different entity to come and do it.
Similar mandate to come and teach. No. They want somebody to curate that for you. There has to be a mediator in between. It's like, when government committees are formed and if there are 10 secretaries and if there's one secretary who happens to be chair, the other 9 will not turn up. So you have to have the chief secretary, that thing, so that, you need to make sure that...
Hierarchy.
Right? So, that's how it works. So the egos at play and all that sort of thing, but a neutral ground often helps. And yeah.
Yeah, which points to a very significant institutional design challenge itself. Right? So I'm just going to come to something very specific with you, Ramesh. I'm just kind of flipping it a little more micro. When you look at behavior change in organizations, there are many ways organizations approach it in terms of there could be training, there could be mentorship, coaching, on the job rotation, and a whole basket of things. And you worked across, at least from what I remember, China, Mexico, and India to a large extent. So in that context, I mean, specifically, if you can talk about how do you empower your employees, train your workforce in terms of driving behaviors, and if there's any change or differences between countries, if we can try and learn from it.
Okay, I'll draw upon the Bosch experience here, but it largely applies to other organizations also, and it's not very different, to be honest. See, every organization typically has some or the other program when you take freshers. It could be in a manufacturing setup or a services setup. Where it differs between countries within an organization is depending on the kind of talent you get from outside, right? If from an engineering digital standpoint, let's say if you're talking about STEM talent in Mexico was still coming up when I worked in Mexico about 8 years back to the STEM talent that was already there in India. So the kind of starting programs that you give to a Mexican when they come out of a typical universities from Mexico City or the other cities like Monterrey or Guadalajara where I worked is going to be slightly different from what you would do in India. In India, I would probably train, and I do have the trainings where we take from engineering colleges, we used to, and then we used to just put them on the job. Then we realized, okay, let's give them project specific or the kind of areas that they need to work, that kind of additional finishing school kind of 3 months, 2 months kind of training. In Mexico, if I try to do that, it wouldn't work. So I probably have to start with one level of training, evaluate them after 6-8 months, then give another level of training. So it slightly differs between countries according to the talent that you have and the kind of job opportunities that they work for. Then you get to the mid-level or junior level where people want to go into leadership or people want to continue into technical, right? Now, if I take a case of Germany as a country and culture and Bosch itself, many people wouldn't look at leadership training unless they are pretty senior. In India, we look at leadership training early on because we think the only way to grow is to become have a people reporting to me kind of scenario. And it took some time for the Gen Z to bring a change to that. Otherwise, you would say, okay, if I've grown up in life means somebody else should report into me, that kind of a situation. So a lot of people who are not suitable for leadership were, I think, pushed into leadership. And we realized that pretty late. But Germany doesn't do that. Germany would continue that you are technical, you continue to be technical, and we respect that. Mexico is a very different country. It's very fast. The workforce is very different. They don't bother about what title you give as long as you give good money. You call me whatever, it doesn't matter. Brand loyalty doesn't matter. I would go from a top-notch, so to say, Fortune 500 to a startup because they pay me 30% more. Yeah, there is some bit of risk, but they give 30% more, 10% is not good enough. 30, 40, 50% is more. If you go to 70% more, they'll grab it between Friday to Monday. And they would not mind that. So Mexican culture is very different. Short-termish and Indian culture is very different. We look at brand, we look at the name of a brand, etc. Only the current 5-6 years pass-outs don't look at the brand the way others used to. So what we realized is that it doesn't matter of the organization. It's the culture of the place that matters the most. So a Bosch in UK will be different from a Bosch in India to a Bosch in China to a Bosch in Mexico. And you can replace the Bosch with any X and it's the same thing. Okay. You can have all your trainings, you can have scale. So in India, for example, we have the training for the juniors or the entry level. Then we have mid-level trainings. Then we have leadership gyms who are 5-7 years into the system, 8 years into the system, who probably want to take up junior leadership position. And then you have the standard global first level leadership, second level leadership, vice president level leadership, and so on, where you get into a talent pool, you get selected, you get trained. That's all common. But what really differs is how the countries and the community culture is. A Bosch in Bangalore behaves different from a Bosch in Coimbatore to a Bosch in Pune, because culturally the places are different. So the culture of the place and that ecosystem and that country sometimes matters more rather than the organizations. In Mexico, for example, as he was mentioning, we had a location of an office where it had a great public transport, and we said it's going to work beautifully. People came for interviews who were early 20s, okay, or mid 20s, and they said, "Where is the parking lot?" We said, "Why?" Because they said, "I want to drive to the office." We said, "We have a great public transport." They said, "We don't like to take public transport." Now, we never understood that. Now, why it doesn't work to some of what Manish says, we don't have the culture of taking a public transport in a city. Whatever you do, it will grow, but it will not grow beyond a point unless you take it as a constraint to be handled. So once we cross a certain tolerance limit of traffic in Bangalore that we can't tolerate, then probably it will force me to take a public transport. Otherwise, I need my comfort. That's what happened with Delhi. Delhi always wanted its own car, but then people realized Noida to Gurgaon is too tough, so let me take one level. But then Gurgaon still is tough because you don't have great metro beyond a point, and you would still rather drive it. So it's a mindset of the people which wants to own an asset. You can't force them to go in a public transport unless you have educated and made that culture entirely from childhood. So in Singapore, nobody says, "I don't want to take a public transport," because they have been attuned towards it. It's the same in an organization because it's a larger country culture and the culture that matters. The other thing, like in Mexico, people want to take certifications. They want to have a string of certifications. You go and tell them, like Germany, on-the-job training matters the most. It doesn't matter them. They would rather have a certificate rather than say on-the-job matters more. Now, the biggest animal that I've not addressed is China, right? It's completely different. China is like 70, 80 years ahead of us. And if anybody still believes China is socialistic, I don't know how many still believe. China is communist. Yes, it is communist, only in the name of the government. China is the most capitalistic and the most entrepreneurial country in the world. I've worked in US, I've worked in Europe, I've worked in, let's say, Mexico, which is still North America. I've visited probably 25 different countries and worked there or visited there. Believe me, but I've stayed in China for 4 years. I've stayed in Mexico for 3.5 years, and Germany as well. China is the most entrepreneurial, and why I say that is because the government doesn't think that they're just a government to maintain things. To Manish's point, and no, we generally think that government's job is to maintain this. They don't think like that. The government acts like a corporate. They create the market. They have a vision for the country which is 50 years ahead, not even 25. So China is now working that by 2035 their population will go down and they will not have enough technology, enough manpower. So this not today, they started realizing it in 2015. So they make every 5-year policy which they calibrate. So China started making the policy that after 2035 when the population declines, we don't want to have a repeat of Japan. So I'm stepping beyond the organization here, if you permit, into the so-called public policy field, which I've seen in action. So China made the policy that how do we have the talented pool? They said we can't create the birth rate more. People are free not to marry, not to have children, not to have relationships. Women are very successful there. So women started asking, I don't need a partner. Then population is not going to come. So they realized all this. They said, let's now work on robotics. Robots will run our factories. And they made that as a public policy, which every forward-looking organization should follow. So when the government says, this is my policy, whether you give an incentive or not, the corporations there and people there automatically want to follow it. Incentives come later. We all have a wrong notion outside of China that government manages everything. No, government incentivizes. But before even the incentive, the people look up to the government to state that this is my policy forward. So they say go for robotics, they will go for robotics. Corporations will invest on their own for robotics because for them China matters. We in India have Indians who do well. India doesn't grow up. There, China grows up, you will hardly hear any Chinese name outside except in a few Silicon Valleys. But you would hear China growing up because the government says this is the policy, these are the 5 areas: AI, chips, semiconductor chips, whatever, which was always there, robotics, and something else. Everybody follows it, starts investing on their own. Banks start giving incentives much later, and they work towards it. Why? Because China as a country starts acting like a corporate. They don't say my job is to maintain. They say my job is to become number one in this. In PPP, purchasing per parity, I'm anyway number one, but on nominal terms, GDP, I want to become number one by this state. And by 2045, even if the population decreases, I want to continue to be number one. By 2060, I want to be here. So even corporations don't think like that, but China acts like a corporate, sets a vision for the country, works backward. I've been to tier 4, tier 5 cities of China. I lived in Shanghai, but due to my business and others, I've interacted also with not just corporates, but governments. You have vice mayors and mayors who are selected and put in, who work through the Communist Party. They work in different cities. They are seen, they are given KPIs. The KPIs are how much STEM talent do you have? This used to be 20 years back. Now they ask how much is the AI talent in your city? They measure that. They have all the measuring mechanism. They measure that. They measured what is the AI talent, what is the pharma talent, what is, or microbiology, whatever. Then semiconductor, chip manufacturing, fab, what is the talent that you have? Very specific. They are given KPIs, they are measured on that. So the government acts like a corporate with very clear KPIs. They are measured over 3 years. They are asked how much of investments have you attracted. So I've had government vice mayors come to Bosch, take me and say, please invest in this place. And I would be wondering, it's a tier 4 city, and tier 4 is very well, no? It's great cities. But they would come and do, because as intercity competition, who attracts investment, both foreign and domestic? And they work like that. So they don't think that they have to just maintain water, sanitation, education, and economy will run. They have a very clear objective. So tier 1 cities have an objective, which is Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. Tier 2 cities have a certain objective. Tier 5 cities have an objective. And it goes up to tier 7 or 8. So they have very clearly demarcated tiers. So I've gone up to tier 6, tier 7, but tier 4, tier 5 is where I've gone for business. So I've seen how they work. And they have those objectives. They work as a corporate. The entire nation moves towards it. And then the point is that government is not, is not a laissez-faire government maintaining the minimum. So you have Stanford and Harvard return guys who are vice mayors, and city council guys who really have an objective how to take it forward. They invest, they build the talent, they get people back from US and Europe and to develop. So it's a very different ball. So imagine if a city, for example, Tamil Nadu I have seen in Hannover Messe in Germany. I was surprised. There's a Tamil Nadu government stall so I was happy to see an Indian stall. Then I spoke to them. It came to Tamil Nadu Guidance Organization. Some of you might have heard. This was established in early 90s by Jayalalitha and it continues. They have a very clear objective to go to different exhibitions across the world and bring investments. So what China is doing probably 30 years back at Shenzhen level, Guangzhou level, Tamil Nadu as a case is doing it. Karnataka has been lackadaisical. Maharashtra was supposed to take part in Hannover Messe in Germany. Apparently, they couldn't make it. We need 20 such government bodies to attract investment. And we don't have them. We have Ikka Dukka here and there, but we don't have them. But that's like acting like a corporate to bring it back. We need them.
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot to chew on, Manish, in that sense. I'm kind of connecting back to a question that's come from one of our online participants, and I'd like Manish you to reflect on this. So the question is, in the development and adoption of disruptive technologies, is it typically the private sector that drives innovation and then the government formulates policies? Or do government policies tend to shape and drive technology changes, including in the private space? I mean, it's kind of framed as a chicken and egg.
And it isn't.
It isn't.
It isn't a chicken and egg thing. So I guess the tech stuff that's been happening, right? I mean, the foundations for that were laid many, many years ago. with all the engineering colleges, etc., from the Nehruvian times and so on. There's this whole sort of belief that the tech boom happened in India because the government kept off it, which is not necessarily true. The government gave several tax breaks. They gave several sort of, well, gave is probably the wrong word. They should have been doing it in any case. But the government did do a fair bit in terms of facilitating the emergence of the sector, not taking anything away from the dynamism that the sector has displayed. But the government has had a role to play. So to think that the tech thing in India has happened because the government just kept its hand off is not true. As far as the present is concerned, I think across government, and I would say this probably started with Chandrababu Naidu way back in the mid-90s, but it's really the last 10, 15 years, it's really sort of taking shape. And plus with Aadhaar and what is the new retail thing? ONDC and so on and so forth. It's really moving ahead. The government has had a role to play. As far as different agencies of government are concerned, I think there is a fair bit of enthusiasm about tech. Now, some of that, a large part of that is coming from the fact that they want to be seen as tech savvy and so on. But a significant part is also coming from the realization that tech is helpful in solving the problems and making decision making easy. So, yeah, but long and short answer to your question, it's not as if the government has kept its hands off and therefore the tech sector boomed. And now the government has had a pretty decent role to play. It has a decent footprint even now. There is a fair bit of embrace of tech in government. People are quite enthusiastic about it, even at the district level and so on. So you'll find many districts actually having done a fair bit of stuff on their own without any guidance from anywhere else. They're finding their talent locally and that sort of thing and moving ahead. So yeah, I don't know whether that
How are
answers.
they driving behavior change internally in such context? Because if the government, in some sense, is pushing tech, they're changing themselves, isn't it?
So I think, like I said, within the government system, especially, I would say, even from the time that Sam Pitroda actually made this CDAC kind of thing way back in the mid-80s and so on, there has been this glamour associated with tech, right? and a fair number of people saw in tech and I'm talking strictly from the sort of point of view of how government servants have come to embrace tech and so on. A fair number of people also saw in this an opportunity to get seen and heard, gradually discovered that there were users of tech that would make their lives easier and make their jobs easier and so on, and that would actually deliver something meaningful. But I think it started off on the fact that you would be recognized if you did something cool in tech, right? So that was one. Now, and there was a parallel set of resistance about computerization and so on and so forth that happened, and that had its own story. But it's fizzled out over time. But it was there pretty much till the mid-90s. But yeah, but I think the fact that if you did something cool and nice and new in tech, that you would get noticed by higher ups, has played a big part in why government servants are. I think it continues to play a big part. So if you can make an app or something, you've good chances of being cited as a case study in some DOPT kind of thing or the other. So that does play a role.
Yeah.
But having said that, I think people are also seeing the merits.
And also there have been some challenges, like places like land where automation brings its own challenges from a political economy perspective.
So also I think, the availability of people who can use tech has also, I'll give you a very simple example, and I'm talking about Kolkata in the early 2000s or mid 2000s. There was the Kolkata Urban Services Program that DFID, now FCDO, used to run. And they were running it in about 40-45 municipalities. Later they expanded to 145. At one point of time, they used to struggle to find computer operators. And this is just about 20 years ago. That is clearly not a struggle now. And you'll find people who are capable of doing much more cool, much more innovative stuff, even in smaller towns now. So that's helped things move.
Okay.
So
Want to
Krishnan,
open
just
up.
wanted to add a couple of points here. Since you asked, and it kind of overlaps with the corporate part. So I personally look for India and ASEAN as a market. Okay, I lead that. One thing that clearly has made a huge, or will be making a huge difference, is the PLI scheme of the government. Probably it's 30 years late, to be honest. We should have done this long back. We missed the manufacturing bus, but we shouldn't be missing it now. The production linked incentives of the government, we have seen in real action because we work with those companies, that greenfield projects and setups are coming up, not only in semiconductor, which has taken the limelight, but also in other sectors like photovoltaic. So one form of government thing, as Manish said, you don't tax them, you give SEZ incentives from the IT side. That's how the 90s boom happened, or rather helped. But today what we are seeing is a very positive forward movement where the money goes to the company's bank account. So I know of a photovoltaic company from Gujarat with whom we are trying to work with. They have set up 12 gigawatt photovoltaic in Odisha. So you have the cell level, module level manufacturing, and below that is the wafer level. So what they're trying to set up is both cell and the module level. But beyond the technicality, the point is that since we didn't do this earlier, we lost the cell and the wafer level to China. So now even these guys have to import it from China because they don't have a choice. But at least the module level they are assembling. They are setting up 4 gigawatt of cell level themselves, and hopefully we reach there somewhere in the next 5-6 years. So Tata Solar is a company, Vari is a company, and all that. But the point about PLI is not only they get the incentive for having set up in Odisha and other places, one of these big companies, I was talking to that purchase and they were saying we have to start the greenfield soon because the government has put in 2,000 crores in the bank account. And by these milestones, if we don't achieve something, we'll be charged a penalty. Not only will the money be taken back, we'll be charged a penalty. And it's a 12,000 crore plant, and 2,000 crore the government has given. It's one example, and so on in many others. If PLIs don't happen, your employment is not going to go up. I mean, everybody talks about where is the job, where are the jobs. Jobs will never come from the government. It has to come from the investments. PLI, if it had been done many years back, we would have been in a far better position. So whatever Indian manufacturing grew, they tried to grow on their own, but now thankfully it is there. The second example is in the utility space. We as Bosch work in the smart meter space. So we don't do the meter manufacturing, we do the back-end IT connectivity and the digital connectivity and the IT. Infra providers like Adani, GMR, and many meter manufacturers are in the forefront. So the government, after seeing that the previous schemes, smart meters has been there for a long time, but they weren't successful. So the government has relaunched a new scheme that is far more successful. There also the government pays incentive or pays a grant, gives a grant for a part of the capital investment that companies have to do. And now you see that every discom in the country wants to adapt and float tenders. So there has to be, I think, in a country like ours, very clear commercial government involvement. Otherwise, you will not see much action happening just by the private sector. So the typical American capitalistic will not work. We need a model which is more government forward-looking, government pushed programs. We have seen the same with railways. Chris has come out with RFPs where they talk about using computer vision in the train for security purpose, where the cameras will capture it, they will go into a computer vision, AI related, and it will be utilized. So in as much as we may not think railways might do it, they do that. And these all have to be government driven, otherwise you will not get that done. So the natural point of corporate sector doing it, I think will be slow unless the government incentivizes.
Great, thanks. So just going to open it up for questions from the audience. Can we have a mic?
Hi, my question is to either Ramesh or Manish, both of you can answer. While India is looking into the pathway of, encouraging startups specifically for AI and robotics, however, we see that the startups fail in securing the funds directly from government. Do you feel that this is also a part of an organizational behavior, or is it not at all relatable to this, specifically talking about robotics in general?
Okay. The knowledge we have is that on startups, right, on these areas, there are clear norms how to get the funding. Okay. Not all the companies are at that level where they can get it, and therefore they fail. But the VC funding anyway remains, the angel funding remains. But we are kind of behind right now to clear those toll gates, those milestones to get that funding. Because it's the same thing. Whatever we are doing now for robotics, we should have done about 10 years back. We are doing it now, but the startups will find it harder if they don't have the core technology of SLAM, situational location tracking, or certain kind of microchip development there. Probably that is the reason they're failing. Of course, I don't have quantitative data points there. Having said that, there are funding. I know in companies with robotics in the defense area or drones in the defense area who have got funding from the defense spending, the corpus, where if I know an organization that got funding up to the third stage or the fourth stage and they were successful. Recently, the Indian Air Force adopted one of the, or rather the Army adopted one of the drones, which was started by a startup which received the government funding, and they were successful. Do we need more examples? For sure, yes. It's also the mindset, right? We have a very services mindset, and if you have to really develop IPs and products, I think a lot more organizations need to work on that to develop it. I mean, even as a corporate, we are also guilty of it. Easier selling is to sell a service. Much harder is to develop a product, develop an IP, productize the IP. See, there are many products for which we go to Israel because they have the IP. As India as a country has not developed IP. We have developed more service capabilities. It's easier. And corporations are short term. It's faster, easier for us to sell services. It's much longer to do that. So you don't have the ecosystem of people who can do it. So startups probably think differently, but they are a little behind in technology. They need to come up. Yes.
If I can venture in addition to that, I mean, if you look at the government of the Ministry of Defense program, the IDEX program, I mean, it's a phenomenal incubation program, which is funded by the Ministry of Defense and encourages these kind of this kind of progress. And it's not just for defense; it's in the space sector as well. So the new space program policy that we have is quite significant. Defense and strategic services, all of them line together, and it comes together quite well. We have the Antrix Corporation and the ISROs of the world. So there's an enabling ecosystem as well. And so what is happening there, I mean, I completely agree. It could have happened about 10 years ago, but at least it's not 30 years behind. It's only 10 years behind. Because that's where the world is moving. It's disrupted to, the latest generation of arms and ammunitions, and we may be able to leverage dual use technology that we then create using these IP and patent laws that then potentially could give us a leg up.
Yeah, thankfully, multiple threads have opened up where, it's not one after the other and we are learning slowly.
I think we probably have time for one more question. Anyone? Yeah.
So, sir, this question is for Ramesh, sir. My question is, when we look at Indian context, the transition from agriculture to industry and then to service has not happened smoothly. Somewhere we missed this transition from agriculture to industry. Now, since we have already missed that, and when you look at the rural sector, there's a lot of distress and a lot of migration which is happening. In that given context, the present situation, what kind of intervention do you think would be really good from the government side? To what kind of industry we can encourage? What kind of such things we can think about to improve the context and also to give a boost to the industrialization which probably we have missed?
Yes. Yeah, it's true that we jumped from agriculture to tertiary. Of course, I'm not a development economist with that right, but I've seen it in action with other countries. Even Mexico has much more manufacturing output. Of course, it helps because of NAFTA, and they are part of NAFTA. They have maquiladora and other things. But the point here is that we say in India the labor is cheap, but the labor is actually costly. It's not really cheap. If you have to set up a 5,000 people plant in India, you will not get the skilled labor to do that. Because there is a skill in operating the machine. We overlook that. We call them blue collar, but we don't have the skill to have 5,000 people who can really operate CNC machines, fabrications, stampings. We don't have that. So what the companies have to do is somehow get the first 500 to 1,000 and will be expensive. It depends on the city you are there. If you are in the western sector, you will get the labor. If you're in the east, you will not get. And after you get a minimum number, you will have to invest in training and getting the 5,000 up. And then you have the labor laws that protects them and they can create all sorts of ruckus. Vietnam, forget China. We also operate out of Vietnam, both Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, and we work with multiple Vietnamese companies. When they talked about China plus one strategy, they didn't talk of India first. They talked of Vietnam and Thailand. Thailand is much more advanced. They have very good manufacturing sector. But Vietnam was discussed because Vietnam can put 10,000, 5,000 people of skilled labor. We can't do that. So we really need to relook from a policy perspective, from a training perspective, how to get the skilled labor right from the institutes or, I mean, they're not the college going, how to get the skilled labor in a way that you can deploy them for industry. So policy incentive is one, but I think we don't have that ecosystem, and I'm not an expert there, but we have seen it in action. It's not easy to run a large manufacturing setup in India, in any place. You can give the incentive, you can put the land, you can do all of that, but where do you get the right labor? It takes time. When we as Bosch opened Hyderabad office, and the previous government was there, that government was talking about developing in Telangana an automotive belt of component manufacturers. Now you need to develop a whole ecosystem. The original equipment guys should come, the car manufacturers, the component guys should come, the whole ecosystem has to develop. You can't give incentive in one place and have one kind of industry. The whole thing has to develop on its own. So everything has to be planned. So that means the governments have to be very proactive to develop it. And when we say government, it's not the central government. They can do only so much to create a PLI. The state governments we have seen who have worked better with the central government have benefited. So from a PLI perspective, we see that Gujarat works closely with the central government. Dahej develops as an area. Tamil Nadu works closely with central government, political issues separate. They take advantage or leverage of the PLI. So Gangaikondan and Tanjavur area is developing very well. But you don't see it with every state government. So if the state governments, and Odisha is another place. So if state governments don't work closely with the center, whatever you do at the center will not get translated on the ground. So I think we have quite a long way to go on the manufacturing sector, but if the PLIs continue and they do, it will take at least 20 years for us to see a valid change. Because the more time you leave, the companies are not going to come back and invest. So it takes time. Even in mobile manufacturing, we are at assembly, but we have to start there. Somewhere we will go down. So as I said, in photovoltaic, we are at module. The cell will happen, then wafers will happen. But it will take 10, 15 years to see a visible change.
Thanks, Shyam. Yeah.
Okay, so you're right about the fact that the transition from rural to urban, etc., and primary to services, manufacturing has been skipped. I'm just trying to look at the present sort of map of India and the infrastructure grid that is emerging and emerging. At the moment, if you look at the 500 top cities of India, the strategic infrastructure and the connectivity infrastructure is coming together. That's a big thing to happen. I would say if you look at the next 5,000 large places, that infrastructure is also getting gridded. It's not getting gridded as fast as it should, but that's happening as well. Fine. So I think the grid in the infrastructure grid connecting the larger cities and sort of manufacturing hotspots, etc., and so on, plus the strategic infrastructure in terms of ports, rail connections, and so on, is falling into place. It should have fallen into place many years ago, but it's now falling into place. And therefore I would say, and given the fact that, the manufacturing battle can't be given up. It might not become as sizable as it is, say, in the case of China, even in terms of proportion, but that it's going to be a very important sort of piece in the whole thing. So the target, I think, is about 35% and so on in the next 6 years. It's going to be difficult to achieve. I don't think it's going to be achieved, but that battle cannot be given up. The infrastructure, fortunately, is coming into place. Skills is a huge issue, no doubt about it. And I don't think even the skill development mission has been sort of successful in actually filling that gap in any significant degree at all. Right? I mean, some places here and there, that's all fine, but that's the other thing that I think that's important that we are missing from this is the MSMEs. That's a large sector. They can do much about what's happening. They actually currently absorb a large number of people. They deliver a large part of our factory output and so on. I don't think we have done enough for our MSMEs as well. So between MSMEs and skills and keeping the infrastructure momentum going, we have a chance of actually bumping up on manufacturing. Having said that, the 35% figure is going to be tough to achieve, but will get somewhere higher than where we are at this point of time. But I think the battle cannot be given up.
Thanks, Manish. I think that's a good summary of the conversation. I think
we don't probably subscribe to a great banker saying that we should continue to do services. And the ex-RBI governor, and it's a wrong policy to do manufacturing. I think some buses have gone, but some mini buses are still there to catch up.
Yeah.
No, actually, can I just add one more thing? He mentioned about Tamil Nadu, and I think it's an important thing. If you look at maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, Haryana was one of the leading manufacturers of automotives and automotive parts. Okay, because of Maruti mainly. That position got surrendered to Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is now way, way ahead. And there's a good domestic example there of how investing in the right kind of skill development, in the right kind of infrastructure, can actually propel one state which was pretty much behind as far as Haryana is concerned, even 50, 20 years ago, as far as automotive parts were concerned. It's way, way ahead. And Haryana has lost the momentum because they didn't do enough on this, and they were content to live with Maruti and whatever it was offering. So there's a lesson even in the domestic circumstances from states like Tamil Nadu on what can be done.
I mean, it's like they take it for granted. They had all the labor unrest, they didn't correct it. West Bengal took a political route. They should have been thankful that Tata Motors was ready to invest there. Yeah. They uprooted a very good investment, and for political as well as, I believe, other corporate reasons, they pushed them out. Nobody wants to come. I mean, you go to Calcutta, you don't even know it's a metro. People say that I do the same job here, but I don't get paid like Bangalore. I'm like, yeah, Bangalore is a metro, you're not. I mean, it's very clear. You have only Salt Lake that has developed. In the last 25 years, what have you developed in Calcutta is just Salt Lake, which is for 5 IT companies and nothing else. So if you take the development for granted, to be honest, even Karnataka has taken its development for granted and Bangalore doesn't do much. People go to Hyderabad, people will go to Telangana. So Tamil Nadu continues to work on it, Maharashtra continues, Gujarat continues, Odisha woke up. Otherwise, you don't have too many examples. Yeah. And that's the issue. So it's like taken for granted.
Yeah, no, I'm holding seriously the last point. Yes, please.
I think there's a recognition. I think some of what you're talking about. There's a recognition now in India, at least, that we are not unique. And I think Aro said this, and there were other folks as well who mentioned this. Yeah. This maverick exceptionalism that we attributed to ourselves is no longer the case. I think we are, in some sense, even borrowing, the 2025, Make in China policy. The 2047 vision 2047 is actually an adaptation of that. And so thank God. I mean, even if we are not sending flights to, China directly, and we can't seem to find enough reasons to fight with them, at least we're adopting
acknowledging it. Yeah.
There is that sense that we can, learn from others as well. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. And there's a vision for the country. We never had that before.
At least.
Great. So I think it's been a wonderful conversation. We started with behavior change. I was looking at it more from an individual micro level. We went to country behavior almost, right? So in some sense, straddling industries, straddling firms, etc. So thank you for that. It's been really, really wide-ranging, and thanks for your generous insights and time. And
That was an amazing discussion. A lot of key takeaways as well. Thank you, distinguished panelists, for your insights and contribution to the discussion. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you, Dr. Geeta Krishnan, for moderating the session.